Greetings, fellow biology students, and welcome to Mr. Dell's review on our first unit of the year. It is an introduction to biology, so we'll go through the scientific method, and we'll talk a little bit about controls and variables. Then we will go through the basic characteristics of life. We'll go through the different taxa of life, and hopefully we'll end up with some examples of organisms in different kingdoms before the end of the unit. Okay, so whenever we intro any science subject here at Pencrest, we always start off with the scientific method. That is the language in which scientists speak to one another. I remember when I was in high school, I never understood what that meant until I actually read real scientific journals. And it is really written in this form where a scientist will have an observation. They will observe a phenomenon here on Earth. They'll make a guess as to what is causing that phenomenon. Then they will design an experiment and collect data on that, and then they will analyze that data. So that is the scientific method. I realize that different variations of science will do different variations of the scientific method, but that's the big picture there on how scientists talk to one another and how we make scientific claims. Some important terms to think about when we think about the scientific method. You should know the difference between a control and a variable. The control is the factor in an experiment that stays the same, and in theory, good experiments have lots of controls, and you only look at one variable. The variable is a factor in an experiment that changes. A theory is a hypothesis that has been tested, repeated over and over and over, and has never been disproven. So you can think of something like evolutionary theory, that we have lots of hypotheses out there to support evolution, and those hypotheses have never been disproven in the world of science. Some of you might remember the experiment that I did with the Coke and the Mountain Dew. If you remember, there were lots of controls there. There were things that stayed the same, but the reason the Mountain Dew sank in water was because it had more carbohydrates or more sugars than the Coca-Cola did. So there it is. So there's the scientific method. We are in biology class. This is the study of all living things. There are many different branches of biology out there. There are some of the big ones. Remember, Mr. Del Prado studied plants and trees for 3 years. I would consider myself a botanist and a forestry biologist. Perhaps not the most exciting for you. Zoology would be an exciting one, right? Looking at different animals. Genetics is an important player in today's world, looking at genetic diseases. Mr. Dell's a big fan of evolution, on how species change over time. Some of you might be interested in microbiology. That's the stuff that keeps me up at night, things like bacteria and viruses and the such. There's some pretty pictures. Top left, I would call that botany. Top right, I would call that zoology. Anatomy and physiology would be the bottom right, and cell biology as you look at some red blood cells there. So there's some major themes that we hit on over and over throughout the year in biology. One of them is the difference between a unicellular organism and a multicellular organism. A unicellular organism is made of one cell. I tend to think of bacteria, but there are protists out there that are also unicellular. Multicellular organisms, I tend to think of plants and animals. I think you should know that most organisms try to maintain the same conditions on the inside of their body over periods of time. That's homeostasis. One that makes me feel uncomfortable talking about in class, right? Sexual and asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is between two individuals, and that generally leads to more genetic diversity. That means more differences between kids and their parents. And then asexual reproduction is when one cell splits into two cells, and that leads to very little genetic diversity, where the offspring, say the offspring bacteria, have almost exactly the same DNA as the parents. We'll talk about how species evolve over the course of the year. We'll talk a little bit about relationships between species, and then we'll also talk about how species get their energy. Autotrophs are photosynthesizers. Heterotrophs are things like you and me that get their glucose from other organisms. So you can see in the top left, there's some unicellular bacteria. In the top right, there's an autotrophic plant. The bottom right, I could see an ant there. That would be a heterotroph. And then the bottom left, there's a shark there that is clearly a heterotroph. One of the big things that we'll hit on this year, and that you'll also see on the Keystone exam, is understanding what does it actually mean to be alive. So we've come up with these properties here on Earth that we think that these are the organisms, or these are the characteristics that if you have these characteristics, we're going to call you alive. If you don't have these characteristics, we're going to say that you're not alive. And a great way to think about this is to compare yourself to a rock. Rocks are not made of cells. You are. Rocks do not reproduce. You do. Rocks do not have DNA inside of them or a universal genetic code. Rocks do not grow and develop. You should know the difference between growth and development. Growth is just getting bigger. Development is changing form. I like to use the example of the caterpillar turning into the butterfly. You obtain and use energy by eating food. Rocks do not. You respond to your environment by running away from a lion as it's running after you. A rock will not. Homeostasis, your body temperature tends to stay the same on the inside. A rock does not have a body temperature that stays the same. It moves up and down with the environment. And then also to remember that species, not individuals, but species will change over time. That would clearly not be true of a rock. So in all the living things that we have here on Earth, scientists came up with a way to kind of classify these organisms. That is called taxonomy. And we have put organisms into specific taxa or categories or groups, if you will, to try to differentiate between one organism and another organism. We did this because we wanted to have essentially a uniform language so that scientists could be talking about the same organisms when speaking to one another. First guy who came up with this classification system was Aristotle. We give him props for coming up with it, but he only divided organisms into two groups, plants and animals. Clearly there are protists, there are fungi, there are bacteria out there. So here he is. There's the dude with the sweet hat, and I think that's a wig. His name is Carolus Linnaeus. He came up with our current classification system, and that is the system with these taxa: the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If you're wondering why I put King Philip came over for a good soup, if you look at the first letter for all of those, it's an easy way to remember it. Kingdom is the most general, and species is the most specific. When we write a species name, we generally write it with it being italicized, and the genus name being capitalized, the species name not being capitalized. Okay, so when we look at the different kingdoms of life here on Earth, we can see that there's plants, there's animals, there's fungi, there's protists like the amoeba or the paramecium. And then there are two within the bacteria kingdom, eubacteria, which are the common bacteria that we see here on Earth, and the archaebacteria, which are essentially bacteria that you find in really extreme environments, like at the bottom of the ocean or in volcanoes and whatnot. So most scientists have been using the traditional five-kingdom system to classify life: the protists, the fungi, the plants, the animals, and the bacteria kingdom. But as scientists recognize differences between the two different types of prokaryotes, they have added in an additional taxa. That taxa is the domain. And there are essentially three domains: the bacteria, which are the regular bacteria that make you sick. Then there's the archaebacteria, the bacteria that are found in really extreme environments. And then there's eukarya, which is plants and animals and fungi. Monera is kind of an old-fashioned term for bacteria. Bacteria are unicellular and asexual. The protists, they're also unicellular, but they're eukaryotic cells. They actually have a nucleus inside of them, and they're generally found in aquatic environments. The fungi are heterotrophs. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. I always like to think of mushrooms when I think of a fungus. Plants are going to be autotrophs. That means they get their energy from the sun. They're multicellular, and their reproduction is all over the place. Sometimes it's sexual and sometimes it's asexual. And there is us, the final kingdom, the animal kingdom. There are some animals that can produce asexually. Most of us tend to think about sexual reproduction when we think of animals. Multicellular, eukaryotic, and I always like to remind everybody that of all the animals on Earth, who's the most diverse? It's going to be the arthropods. It's not going to be something that's nice and furry. It's going to be an organism that likely has a shell and is gross. Well, there you have it. There's the introductory unit, all in 11 minutes and 15 seconds. Well, hopefully I'm going to see you on down the line. Thanks a lot for listening.